All right, welcome to the special Rising Tide Foundation broadcast, where I am very happy to be joined by a very interesting researcher and filmmaker, Jack Kelley, who has recently sent me a lovely gift in the form of a book he recently published called The Atlantis Puzzle. And this caught my attention originally as a concept when over a year ago, a friend of mine sent me this video saying I have to watch this film about Atlantis. And in my mind, I honestly, Jack, I kind of yawned a little bit before I watched it. I was like, another film about Atlantis. Okay, like what new can be said about this topic that has been so highly belabored again and again? It's clear no one's ever gonna know. There's so many different hypotheses that are out there. And I watched your film, and I was happily surprised that a completely refreshing new paradigm and methodology was introduced to me that I think zeroed in on an argument for the real Atlantis in a way that I've never seen before. So, without further ado, Jack, what got you into this? And generally speaking, were you also or going into this? Were you always obsessed with Atlantis and trying to figure it out, or is this something that caught you off guard as you began your investigation?
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me. Well, as I've mentioned occasionally in the past, I was not an Atlantis aficionado. In fact, I actually had written a screenplay many years ago that was ridiculing the idea of these people who are on the conspiracy theory hunt for the next lost continent and stuff like that. And what is the sort of Godzilla of them all? It's Atlantis. So of
Yeah.
course it always gets dragged into any conversation about advanced ancient civilizations, mythology, climate change, natural disasters, abrupt interruptions in the human past. But I have deep interest in the ancient world and in ancient history and archaeology, but I wasn't what I would say a conspiracy theorist. So I didn't really have any interest or more than a passing familiarity with Atlantis beyond having read the story as a young man,
Yeah.
reading Plato, when you're in school and stuff like that. But when I was on vacation on the Greek island of Santorini in, I think it was 2019, I stumbled onto the work of George Sarantatis, who is a Greek researcher, quite by accident. And Sarantatis is the guy that we follow in the film and whose theory has sort of opened back up the conversation around, yeah, there he is, uh, around Atlantis because of the way that he approached the subject. And so George is a very serious classical amateur scholar. He lives in Athens, Greece, and on one of the islands. And George had published a bunch of papers in the first half of the 21st century here at a bunch of conferences. And the way I found his work, it was in a book that was on a bookshelf in the lobby of the hotel where I was staying. So my wife just picked it out and was like, "Hey, take a look at this." I hadn't brought anything with me to read per se, so I just sort of was lounging by the pool while I was on vacation in Santorini reading George Sarantitis' stuff. So by the end of reading his papers, like the hair was standing up on my neck, and I thought, okay, here's a guy who, without any sensationalism, any things that contradict physics, anything that even contradicts the archaeological record, has maybe solved one of the greatest historical mysteries of mankind. And so from that point on, I got in touch with George and I just realized I read his book, which is unfortunately out of print. I think he's working on a new version. And decided to make the documentary about it.
What I found interesting in the approach that you introduced and that George, I think you did a pretty loyal job at reproducing George's insights and his own discovery, is the fact that you did exactly what Schliemann had done over a century ago, which was to put aside all of the academic, authoritative, standard model assertions about what, at this point, Schliemann is the guy who discovered Troy. What is Troy, as a mythical thing that Homer just invented for entertainment's sake? But Schliemann actually said, how about we treat what's in the document, what's in the Odyssey, what's in there, as if we can learn something and follow the geography, follow the geometry, follow what's being said about the terrain. And lo and behold, Troy was in fact discovered. And George seems to have actually done something you wouldn't think it was so groundbreaking, but he just simply said something similar, which is, let's actually hear what Plato is saying in the Critias and the Timaeus and just take from what he's saying evidence that we could maybe use to first prove why most of the dominant theories that are prevalent are wrong. And I love the fact that you put Plato right there on the cover of your book. And it's also a very, very important aspect of the story because that's who invented, or not invented. And that's why we know of Atlantis today, is from the stories of Plato, but also Plato's method always involves in his dialectics first proving why a dominant hypothesis that might be popular, that might be persuasive, is actually grounded on false axioms. So he has to create a negative proof before you can become aware of what you didn't know that you thought you knew, so that then you can become free to start making real hypotheses and solving the problem. And I love that you use the Platonic method. So the first question I've got here is, a lot of people say that Atlantis was located in like the Azores. That's, I think, the dominant hypothesis I've seen. There's also some of the Bimini Ridge, near the Bermuda Triangle, and there's a few other locations, but I think that one's the big one. What did George do to first demonstrate that those can't be true if Plato is speaking truthfully?
Yeah, and Matt, I think I'm pleased that you brought up the Platonic slash Socratic method of, in a lot of Plato's dialogues, for people who haven't read it or for whom it's been a long time since they read this stuff in college, you know, you often start out in some of these Platonic dialogues with a controversy of some sort about something or other. It could be fill in the blank, right? And as the characters converse, and usually Socrates shows up and starts asking a bunch of questions, and by the end of it, people wind up in what's called a state of aporia. And aporia, it means a kind of a state of unknowing or bafflement. And so I think the theory about Atlantis being in the center of the Atlantic Ocean came about from kind of two fundamental problems. One is the theory was originally advanced, as far as I could tell, by Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote a book. I think it was around 1882, something like that. And as you astutely pointed out, that's right about the same time period that Schliemann actually discovered Troy. So what's going on at the time? People are excited. People are saying, wow, we just found Troy. What else that we thought was a myth might have actually been real? The problem is we're in the Victorian era and people don't have an advanced knowledge of climate science, or the theory of plate tectonics wasn't even really adopted until the middle of the 20th century in most places, even though the guy who came up with it much earlier.
Right.
So you're dealing with a world where there's a justifiable awe and fascination with this notion that real things from the ancient world could be rediscovered. But at the same time, Donnelly's working with, and I don't believe Donnelly spoke ancient Greek, I could be mistaken, but he's dealing with, at least most of the dominant English translations at the time said exactly that. This was a continent, and that, you have to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get there. The fact that George picked up on when he was digging into this, and by the way, George had done a lot of work, not just on the Atlantis story, but on Plato's use of mythology in general. And he had developed a theory called the methodology of mythology. So George was sort of applying this analytical framework to try to understand, well, why is a guy who's so known for rationalism and logical thought and so forth using myth so prevalently? And of course, you could come up with a lot of reasons, apolitical allegories or ways to make a point without making the point, literally, things of that nature, right? So George got fascinated with this, and he looked at this question of the Atlantic Ocean, and he's reading the original ancient Greek. He's looking at the translation, and suddenly something slapped him in the face, which is this doesn't say Atlantic Ocean. The word okeanos does not occur in the Timaeus or the Critias. And just so everybody knows that this isn't some historical shift, Plato did use the word okeanos in other Platonic dialogues. I go into that in a fair amount of detail in part three of the new book. So right then and there, this light bulb goes off. George says, this doesn't say okeanos, it says Atlantic pelagos. Well, what the heck is a pelagos for those who don't speak Greek? A pelagos is a sort of semi-enclosed sea. So modern Greeks use that word to refer to the Aegean Sea or the Ionian Sea, or yeah, there you go, or even the Adriatic, something like that.
Hmm.
So and Plato was known for to be a very specific user of language. And so if he meant to say that Atlantis was located in a pond, he would not have said it was located in a lake and
Hmm.
or an ocean or a sea or the St. Lawrence River, right? He was very specific about the body of water that he was using. And Matt, just to put a nail in that, um, what we today in English call the Black Sea, the Greeks called the Euxenos or Euxenios Pontos. And that meant the brackish sea, friendly to strangers. The preface EU meaning good or positive,
Hmm.
like a eulogy or euphemism. But it used to be called the Azenios Pontos, which meant the sea unfriendly to strangers. Well, why did that change? Because the Greeks colonized parts of the Black Sea and created trading relationships there and
Right.
had city-states and so forth. So they were very specific in the ancient world with the use of language. So I give that as a backdrop so people don't think that we're smoking crack here. These are true historical facts that anybody can look up.
Yeah, absolutely. The issue of the pillars of Heracles tend to be, I think, a big data point that is creates I mean, it's a lead that Plato gives us that somehow to get to Atlantis or to get from Atlantis to parts of the world that will be invaded by the Atlanteans, you got to pass through the pillars of Heracles, which again, Straits of Gibraltar seems to be the closest thing that a lot of people have zeroed in on. But that would also imply that it's coming in from a land within the Atlantic Ocean, which, as you pointed out, is actually not in the original text. It's not in the original Greek. That's been, Benjamin Jowett and others mistranslated that. Somehow it was not corrected. It kept the lie kept going for some reason. But if this is a pelagos, that would not satisfy the criteria of what's being said in the text. So where would you think, where did George come up with a better hypothesis of the location of these pillars of Heracles that one would need to pass through to get to Atlantis?
Yeah, and this is a two-part thing, and I've had people spit all kinds of nonsense at me. I actually had a guy comment on the film somewhere, stop saying Heracles, it's Hercules. And he said, that's what the Latin said. And so I politely responded and said, well, since Heracles was a Greek hero, and Plato wrote this story in ancient Greek, and ancient Greek preceded the construction of Latin by at least 2,500 years. I'm going to go with the ancient Greek pronunciation, which is Heracles. So there's a lot of the danger there is knowing a little, just knowing enough to be dangerous primarily to yourself, right? So I just want to throw that out. And today, of course, we say the Pillars of Hercules are at the Strait of Gibraltar. That is where we have agreed, just like we agree to call it the Strait of Gibraltar, right? It doesn't have its own those rocks were not born with that name. They
Mm.
were given that name by people. We agree to call geography things. If you go back, Matt, to the era before Plato, right? So we're talking kind of 405 to 600 BC. Um, and you go back to ancient authors, actually throughout the ancient world, you're going to find that they place pillars of Heracles in different locations around, typically around the Mediterranean. And even later and during the Roman period, Tacitus, for example, places a set of pillars of Hercules, I think, up at the mouth of the Rhine in the North Sea. So, what does this mean? Well, Heracles or Hercules, being a mythical figure, um, was part of the famous Jason the Argonaut story, and he was known to have traveled all over, doing his 12 labors. He became symbolic, or right? These pillars became symbolic locations, which kind of delimited the extent of Greek awareness of their world, right? So you'd say, well, then why are they in different locations? Well, if you think about it, as the Greeks were expanding across the Mediterranean with their seafaring, there's a new limit. Just like the western border of the United States continued to change throughout the 17 and 1800s, right? As
Mhm.
we acquired more land or as the frontier advanced, if you said, what's the Western, where's the Western frontier? That means something different in 1799 than it does in
Someone would have said
1899.
the Allegheny Mountains, or maybe later on Colorado, but it's never the same thing that is the idea shaping the words. Absolutely, that's important.
And I think that this is a really smart thing by Plato because by referencing essentially a moving target, he's making a subtle commentary about the nature of fixed truth.
Mm,
So just put that in the back of your mind, right? If is it, well, it's definitely at the border. Which border are we talking about,
mm,
right? So that's one fact. The other thing is the Greek word for the pillars in the dialogue is stelae,
mm,
right? As we would call it a stela or a stele in English. And what that means, so one meaning was yes, a kind of a structural column or something, but the more prevalent meaning was like a historical marker carved in stone that would be left somewhere. So the Greeks loved to leave markers, right? When they'd win a battle, they'd set up a little trophy and,
mm.
Athens beat, whoever here on this date. Um, so if you take a step back and you say, okay, the pillars are a kind of commemorative plaque that demarcate the limits of knowledge, and you have to pass through those to cross a body of water called the Atlantic Pelagos, and then on the other side of that, you're going to get to Atlantis. Well, it's rich in both geographical and symbolic meaning, right? So as far as the reason why George, and I hope people will, of course, read the book and watch the movie, but the reason that I think uh, George was able to pin down this location based on a series of other historical references that I won't get into here. But you'd say, well, I've never heard of Pillars of Heracles in Tunisia. I know Pillars of Heracles at Gibraltar. So the gut instinct is to say, this must be wrong. But I promise anybody who goes back and rereads these historical authors or look up references to the Pillars of Heracles in classical dictionaries or encyclopedias, your hair is going to get blown back because George is right. And I've fact checked this all myself. So
Yeah.
here you have Plato saying you have to pass through the Pillars of Heracles by sea in a body of water, which at the time of the Atlantis story was navigable. So that's a key right there. The Strait of Gibraltar has never been unnavigable during the course of human history, as far as I'm aware. The Mediterranean did dry out about 5 million years ago, but presuming that Homo sapiens is about 300,000 years old, it hasn't dried out in the last 300,000 years.
And so
So
you're
it was
saying Plato's
never
language, Plato said he explicitly used the language, it was navigable at this time?
at the time of the Atlantis
So,
story. He said
all
it was
right.
it
So
was
you're,
at
all
that
right.
time it was navigable.
That's an
Yeah.
important clue, right? Because it's easy to brush over that, but the weight of that is serious. That means that where it is today is not
Not
navigable
navigable.
because it was navigable when this was happening, and he actually has a date. You could relatively zero in on the approximate date what is it, like 9,000 BC or something? I'm not even too sure exactly what
Yeah,
it's.
about 9,600
Yeah.
BC is the time of the mythological story that is
Mm,
being told, right?
mm,
Well, so how could this all possibly have any truth? It sounds like a tall tale so far.
mm,
Well, enter the Green Sahara, which is a real, widely understood, non-controversial fact pattern in the Earth's climate, which runs on these 20,000 year cycles. And North Africa becomes like a green savanna with these enormous mega lakes.
okay.
And these lakes, at their maximum extent, might look something like the image I think that you're showing, Matt. Um, and you can see right up there at the top this mega lake, which is called the Schatz Mega Lake. And
The-
that, sure enough, has an entrance to the Mediterranean
mm.
in what is modern day Tunisia. And so
I'm just
there's
gonna show.
also a,
I'm gonna show
yeah,
just
there's
this picture
also,
here, right? This is it, the Shots Lake up there,
so
and
this is more what the extent of the modern lakes are since it's
okay,
dried out.
okay.
And that is the Gulf of Gabes. So there's another Greek author called the Pseudo Skylax who wrote maybe 100 or 200 years after Plato. I'm going to get that wrong, but he definitely came after him, and he speaks about very similar geography, almost using some of the same language that Plato employs to describe it. So there is other textual evidence that suggests that this region was the region intended. And of course, if you go back to 9,000 BC, yes, there was an enormous mega lake there, far larger than the current lakes are today. And those lakes today are only really navigable in the rainy season by small boats. So, so based on this fact pattern, and I've been kind of going into a bit of the detail, Sarantatis was able to say, wow, it looks like Northwest Africa or Western Africa is the geography that was intended here, which makes a heck of a lot of sense for a variety of reasons, right? The ancient Greeks knew about three continents that as far as we're aware of in the written sources: Asia, North Africa or Africa, and Europe. And they were not aware, as far as we know, of the Americas or Australia or Antarctica. Now, so what's all this mean?
Hmm.
It means that there is a physical location for the story of Atlantis that matches up really well with both fact sets from the ancient world around Plato's time period and modern climate science that that shows that there were these huge bodies of water here that presumably could navigate. Matt, I think the thing that a lot of people have jumped to the conclusion after seeing the film, hopefully they will not jump to this conclusion after reading the book. Jack says it was all real, and or George says it was all real. Just because you have a setting for a story
Hmm.
that's real doesn't mean that the story, in fact, took place exactly as described. And in fact, I think we could probably agree that this story is comprised of true and false elements, right?
Yeah.
Because unless you believe that Poseidon was a real guy who actually started fathering children, deep in the distant past, who became Atlanteans, um, then you have to agree that the story at least contains some fantastical elements.
So let's take a moment there, and just maybe rehash the official story itself, because I think that some people watching this it might be a vague memory about the context, the setting that the story emerges in, both the Timaeus and the Critias, and maybe some of the anomalies, especially with the Critias, that struck your mind and George's mind, and I think everybody's mind who's read the Critias and all felt the same frustration, right? When you're about to get into the thick of things about the story of Atlantis, it cuts off. And
Right.
Plato is there. He's somewhere in Egypt. He's at a certain temple of Sais. And maybe you could say something about the nature of the world that Plato was living in, such that he found himself in Egypt and learning from the Egyptians his own history and being chastised a little bit for having the memory of small children and not having recollected something important about their past. So maybe you could rehash some of that story for our viewers today.
Yeah, and this is really wild, Matt, because Plato, of course, is known to have said to have visited Egypt, Sicily, southern Italy, etc., in his travels. And all of those, of course, he was from Athens, all of those places find their way into the Timaeus and the Critias in the form of the hometowns of the different characters. So that's a nice little nugget that shows you that it's not just being repeated verbatim from some carving somewhere. So the story that takes place in the Timaeus and Critias is that Socrates and three other guys, Timaeus, Critias, and a guy named Hermocrates, are hanging out in Athens. And Socrates has just given a speech, which is said to be the day before. Not, it doesn't occur in Timaeus. Most about an ideal city state. Most scholars agree that this refers back to Plato's earlier book, The Republic. So a sort of idealized, intellectually created, perfect society, city state. So Socrates says, guys, glad you enjoyed the speech. I'd love to hear some speeches from you. And they say, we would love to give speeches. And Timaeus says, I'll go first. But before he goes, Critias pipes up and says, hey, guys, while we were listening to Socrates' story yesterday, again, not in the dialogue, I couldn't help but realize that this matched up exactly with a story I heard from my grandpa, whose name was also Critias, when I was a little kid. And I can't remember the exact story, but tonight I'm going to go home and try and write it all down, and I'll come back and I'll tell you it tomorrow. So then we go into the Timaeus, and the Timaeus is a complete dialogue. It deals with a kind of cosmogony, like kind of creation of the universe, and how God and the natural forces came together to create everything, all the way down to the creation of human beings, and how human beings are comprised based on the two forces of intellect and necessity as they're working together. Boom, we're done with that story. The second story is the Critias. And as you mentioned, the Critias is pretty short. It's maybe a quarter of the length of the Timaeus. And so it's not finished. In fact, this story cuts off mid-sentence. And as you alluded to, Matt, it's a story being told by Critias, whom I believe to be Critias the Third, who would have been an old man at the time, and who was a distant relative of Plato, actually. Not Critias the tyrant, who became a tyrant, I think, around 404 BC or something like that, 405 BC. But and was that Critias's, I think, nephew or something like that. I might be getting
That would have been during the 30 tyrants in
precisely.
Right.
So people reading the name Critias at the time, then the dialogue was written around 360 BC. They would have thought of the tyrant Critias, but again, based on how the story is constructed, it's and the age of the Critias figure, talking about the timelines and so forth. It makes a lot more sense that it's Critias the Third. Anyway, he comes back. So picture him as an old man, and he's sort of saying, "Look, I can barely remember what happened yesterday, but I can tell you when I was a kid for sure. This is the story. I thought about it last night. I wrote it down, and I'm going to tell you it. And it is the story about how Solon, who was one of the seven sages and who was friends with my great-grandfather, Dropides, he, after he constructed the Athenian constitution, he went traveling and he went to Egypt. He went to Sais and the great temple there, and he met with the high priests. And the high priests, so Solon was, now keep in mind, Egypt stood for all that was most ancient in the Greek mind, right? And of course, Egyptian society and culture, we know, had proceeded for many thousands of years, even prior to dynastic Egypt. So justifiably, they said this is the oldest place around. And so Solon goes there. He's talking to the priest at Sais, and he wants to talk to him about ancient history because he's interested in the subject. So he starts going into the Greeks' version of their own history. And of course, as you get back farther and farther, Matt, the stories get vaguer and you kind of get into demigods and heroes. And eventually you get to flood myths, right? To the flood of Deucalion. And the priest has just kind of got this smirk and he's just kind of laughing at him. And Solon, who's this wise, noble figure, says, "What?" And the priest says, you Greeks are you're always children. You don't know your own history. And because every time you guys rise, there's some disaster or war or famine or something happens, and you guys get knocked back down and you have a dark age. And then you have to kind of reinvent everything again. So you've lost out all this past history and you're not aware of it. Yeah, even reinventing writing. But we Egyptians, because we're not subject to all these kind of disasters, we've got it all written down in our temples, right? Right back there. You can't go in, but I got it written down back there. And I'm going to tell you a story that's going to show you just how little you know and just how much we know. And that's the story of how your own ancestors, Solon, once defeated a mighty, aggressive empire that was trying to enslave all of Europe and Africa and Asia at the same time. And they were called Atlantis. And so then he goes into the whole story of the Atlantean culture and what they were like. But most people miss this. He also talks about what ancient Athens was like in 9600 BC. Now, of course, you and I know there was no archaeology shows that there was not the city state that is described in the myth existing in Athens at 9600 BC. So obviously this isn't actually literally true. There were people living in the area of Athens in 9600 BC. Excuse me. It was inhabited, but this is sort of a first clue to the modern mind. The story can't possibly be literally true because everything we know about the Athens of this time period was, kind of shepherds living in caves and things of that nature. So that's sort of the backdrop. And just as we're getting into the meat of the conflict and the war, and it's all going to take off, the story cuts off mid-sentence. And so this has led a lot of Orthodox scholars to believe that Plato never finished the story. Either he kind of got sick or he got bored of it and he didn't have time, or he lost interest because it wasn't really going the way he wanted. And he thought it would be much more interesting to write a different book. And the last book he wrote is called The Laws. And anybody who's ever read it will realize that's a damn long and thorough book. So I don't think he was just running out of time and he was, sick on his deathbed, or that he was too lazy to finish it, because he sure wrote the heck out of the laws. And that leaves you to wonder, what happened? Did we lose the rest of the manuscript somehow? That happens sometimes, right? Manuscripts get brought back in fragments. Or was it left that way on purpose? And if that is true, suddenly we got to go back to the whole idea of Plato creating puzzles and using tricks and allegories and illusions and complexity that you have to figure out as the reader. Yeah. Why would somebody leave this off part way? What would he be pointing you to?
That is exactly what is so important and fascinating, and what I appreciate so much about this approach that George and yourself have really resonated with is that Plato is always putting you, he's never being literal. He's always placing you within the problem and helping you discover why your naive assumptions about reality are not capable of solving the problem that you are now in. So by discovering learned ignorance, by becoming perplexed, it's really a gift. Some people get pissed at him, but it's actually a gift that allows them to then generate with the clues provided, a solution concept, a resolution to the dissonance, a resolution to the paradox. So in this case, we got a bunch of elements that have been introduced, some myth mixed with some fact. There definitely was, it seems, I think there's a good case of the material terrain. I think that George does lay out a pretty good case that the Chot's Lake, the Gulf of Gabes, is most likely what is being referred to, especially when you take what you just brought into consideration, the Green Sahara, that I think is pretty well proven. I mean, we could talk about that, but I think that the case is pretty well proven that there were very navigable, massive lakes, very green, lush Saharan regions right after the Holocene. Okay, but then there's other elements that are mythologized a little bit. Now, Plato is living in a world, he had to leave Athens. His mentor was just killed. The Democratic Party that came in after the 30 tyrants had just started acting a lot more tyrannical than even the 30 tyrants did, who were, so you had Greece that had already been sliding into like some really bad places. The Democratic Party voted by the influence of sophists to execute his mentor Socrates. Before that, you had the Peloponnesian War, this long, wasting war. I mean, the amount of death when you hear the stories of plague, of death, of everything under Pericles' Athens. They call it the Golden Age, but you look at what was happening. It was anything but that. And Plato was really trying to bring some lessons about what allowed that to happen. So this, you make the case that there are some similarities between the Peloponnesian War and the story of the warlike Atlanteans who went and suppressed the Egyptians, and everybody had fantasies of world domination. Could you say a little bit more about why you think these parallels, or in what degree these parallels are important? And then maybe we could say a word or two about the actual physical terrain of the real Atlantis as well, because I do want to give people a sense that this is not entirely purely myth. There is actually some actual physical stuff to satisfy those desires we have too, that George is bringing to the surface.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and this is something that came to light. I think there are parallels if you really go back and read the story, both to the Persian War or Persian Wars and to the Peloponnesian War. So
Mm,
these were the two great wars that had been fought over the kind of preceding 2, 3 generations. And
mm,
Plato himself probably fought in the Peloponnesian War. So what was the Persian War, if you're not familiar? The Persian Empire was the mightiest empire on earth in that era. And we're talking about, call it 480 BC or something like that. So first you had Darius and then you had Xerxes. So there were two series of invasions about 10 years apart. And the Persian army was said to be over 1 million men and just shook the ground when they marched. And this is, of course, involves the famous story of Thermopylae and the
mm,
300 Spartans holding the pass, right?
mm,
So wonderful, true stories, incredible. But this was this idea of a massive, dominant empire that was invading from the east. So the concept of this wouldn't have struck the Greeks as unfamiliar, but it would have immediately incited the memories or the cultural memories of the Persian War, during which Athens was completely obliterated, just about burned to the ground. This would have brought this to their memory, right? Like if I'm telling you a story about an evil power that emerges out of Central Europe and is trying to take over the world and dominate with a partner in Asia, you're immediately thinking of World War II, right? Um, so that's item A. Item B is the Peloponnesian War. Well, what was that? So this is mostly characterized by a wonderful author named Thucydides, who wrote a masterful history of the war. And this is a war between two coalitions, a coalition around Athens and a coalition around Sparta. And as you alluded to, it was just a brutal series of wars, which also took place in 2 phases. And so the phasing of the Peloponnesian War is remarkably similar to the phasing of the Atlantean War. And I don't think that's
Hmm.
a coincidence. I believe that that's intentional or meant to call up in the mind, because you have to put yourself in the mind of the ancient Greek reader reading this story, right? I mean, this wasn't written for you and me in modern US and Canada or Europe. This was written for fellow ancient Greeks at the time of Plato's own era, who would have immediately seen some of these illusions, I think. So in the Peloponnesian War, it was started, I think it was Corinth attacked an Athenian ally, and that started the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. So the Athenians were kind of the good guys. Oh, we're on the defensive. You guys are the aggressors. Same thing happens in the Atlantis story, right? The Atlanteans are the attackers.
Hmm.
And then in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian side ultimately counterattacks and they go after Syracuse in Sicily, who was a Spartan ally. Well, that's a large city on an island that you have to cross the water to get to, and it's located remarkably close to the entrance to the Shots Lakes.
Hmm.
So those parallels, I think, are very similar. And in the Atlantis story, of course, let's call them the proto-Athenians, because I don't believe they really existed,
Hmm.
attack the Atlantean forces. And of course, to get to the Atlantean capital city, you got to sail through all these waterways. So they would have followed a very similar route to the route toward Syracuse. So I think that these parallels alone, and there are many others that I get into in the book, even if the Atlantis story was based on a pre-existing myth, which it may have been, um, I think it's hard to argue Plato didn't layer his own ideas and historical illusions and modify it just the way that we get remakes of movies and stuff. I mean, how many versions of Dracula have there been, right? And they're all a little different, or they tell the story a little differently from a different angle, or
Yeah.
they emphasize things that are popular at the time, right?
Hmm. Hmm. I partially want to ask you a question, the next question, about something which I fear is a punchline that I don't want to rob people of that eureka feeling that I felt towards the end of the documentary it's in your book. But that relates to Homer's Odyssey and how the Critias ends. So maybe I'm not going to ask you that question. I'm not going to ask you that question. No, I'm going to leave that for a eureka for people who might be watching, wondering what the hell am I talking about. So let's just leave that in the background as a very important punchline that I'm hoping will act like a splinter in people's minds that they want to remove by watching your documentary and reading your book. So let me ask you this one. As far as the physical terrain, um, at the Atlantis capital city is described in a very specific way as having sort of been organized, or I think even you made the point that in the Critias it's 40 kilometers in diameter, and the capital is organized around concentric circles of a certain nature with certain walls surrounding them, gilded with certain types of copper, tin, other things, other metals, and surrounded by a lot of water as well. In this, as you pointed out, would be a pelagos. So where would the most likely candidate be in Africa if this is to be zeroed in? Do we have any markers?
You sure do. And this is a lot of people thought this was just kind of a meme or just some people throwing darts in the dark. But a place called the Richat structure in what's modern Mauritania. And when George went through the schematic geography of how the Atlantis map was set up, there's supposed to be this city in the center of the continent, which which is comprised of these rings, and it's described as a natural feature, which later was built upon and turned into a huge capital city. And sure enough, if you look at the geography of Western Africa, the Rishat is just about dead center in the region that George identified as Atlantis. That must have must have knocked his socks off when he first discovered that probably about 20 years ago. And he actually, Sarantatis, as a sidebar, went to Mauritania, hired a team, went out there with altimeters and made maps of the whole region and tried to figure out if, in fact, this was just a coincidence or if it mapped up well. And of course, today anybody can go on Google Maps and quote discover it. But Sarantatis was there on the ground back in 2008, and there's photos of him there. So pretty remarkable.
Hmm.
Now, this led any number of people, Matt, and you can find them on YouTube, to have gone out there. And a bit like me, I thought when I saw that and I read George's backup for all this, uh, I thought my first thought was I got to book a flight tomorrow and pack my shovel. I got to get out. We got to get out there. We got to find Atlantis. It must be buried there.
Yeah.
But as I continued to do the research and work on the film, and particularly doing the work, all the work that's gone into this new Atlantis Puzzle book, you start to realize that there's got to be more to the story, right? It's not just a factual piece of history that's being relayed verbatim. And hopefully people have realized some of the things we've been talking about point in that direction, right?
Hmm.
So, but the Richat, look, the fact is people did live there. There's tons of stone tools that have been found there.
Hmm.
We know people were living there at the end of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Holocene, which is the era of the Atlantis story.
There were
So,
boats. You even pointed out that there's been discovered in clay these pretty long, big longboats that have been discovered deep down in clay deposits in that terrain.
well, that's more down near in Nigeria actually.
Oh,
So
right.
that's
The Congo
closer to
Niger.
where the
Right. Yeah. Right.
yeah, the Chad mega lake would have been, which by the way, the Dafuna canoe was discovered right near the edge of what Lake Megachad would have been. So it corroborates the idea that there were people spending a lot of time on the water here.
Mm.
So we've discovered that, seafaring goes back not just thousands of years, but tens, possibly even hundreds of thousands of years. And there's very good evidence for that on islands in the Mediterranean, as well as when you find something like the Dafuna canoe, which is about 8,500 years old. And so when you put together, one of the things we do in the film and that I do in a much greater degree in the book is look at the true and false. Well, what some of these things don't appear to have been true that are spoken about in the myth, but some of them are shockingly have real parallels in the ancient world that are attested to with archaeological evidence, such as transcontinental trade routes in the Stone Age,
Yeah.
boats, people sailing across the Mediterranean, not just 10,000 BC, but 20,000, 40,000, 80,000, 130,000 years ago. And this is, there's no way to explain these things other than somebody sailed out there and left these tools, these artifacts on these islands that were never connected to the mainland. And they were, it wasn't like you could just swim out there across, 30 kilometers.
Mhm.
So I think things like that start to really excite the people who want to believe this story is literally real. Um, I think this starts to become problematic when people start combining the idea of Atlantis with ancient nuclear war between Atlantis and the continent of
Yeah.
Mu, or aliens showed up through an interdimensional portal and crossbred with dinosaurs, and a bunch of that, they had power crystals and a bunch of stuff like that. Because Atlantis has become this catch-all, it's taken on a symbolism beyond its original meaning, in the same way that I think that like the Arthurian legend or Troy, or many of these things, they conjure ideas to our minds, but they don't. But if you go back and read the original story, it's the modern fantasy or vision of these things, like Aquaman, Marvel superheroes talking to sharks and stuff, swimming around with a trident underwater, doesn't have anything to do with the Atlantis myth, other than the fact Poseidon had a trident. So,
Right. Right. And I mean, the similarities between Poseidon and Athena as well is also an interesting idea too, right? That you have a sort of idea of wisdom associated with the figure of Poseidon. Or am I
And
not there?
you have a conflict between those two figures, and I think those who read the book will really get into this. But
Mm,
the idea of a conflict between Athena and Poseidon has a lot of precedent in Greek myth and Greek history,
mhm,
right? So Poseidon's the patron god of the Atlanteans. Athena's the patron goddess of the ancient Proto-Athenians who are battling the Atlanteans in the story.
mm,
Well, what other story contains a proxy battle between Poseidon and Athena? The Odyssey. Poseidon is trying to make Odysseus suffer because he killed his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. And Athena is Odysseus's patron goddess, and she's trying to help him. Proxy war. Same thing as in the Atlantis story. That alone supports the reading of the hey, there's an allusion back to the Odyssey, and even in doing so, and there's much more to this, Matt, which people will
yep.
get to in the book. I've got several pages devoted to just the Athena Poseidon conflict and other places it occurs in Greek mythology. But um, what Plato also may have been commenting on is the nature of war and enemies and conflict. Because if you go back to the Iliad, Athena and Poseidon are on the same team. So there's a changeable nature. Also in the
Yeah.
dialogue, Hermocrates, who is supposed to give the third speech and never does, he was a Syracusan general who defeated the Athenians in the second half of the Peloponnesian War. What's he doing hanging out in Athens, being called a friend?
Mm,
Right? That means the dialogue must be set prior to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, which supports Critias III being the Critias being mentioned because he died in 429 BC. Peloponnesian War started in 431 BC. So you keep going layer after layer, man.
yeah.
And this is the remarkable thing about this story that I really want people to see is you can go 20 layers deep into this story and just be getting started scratching the
Yeah.
surface. This is an unacknowledged masterwork. This should be up there with the Iliad and the Odyssey and any other great work of the Western canon in terms of this should be the Timaeus and Critias should be acknowledged alongside the Republic as some of Plato's best work.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I would not have agreed with you had I not experienced this process of discovery that you've replicated and that George has replicated for other people to go through and re-experience for themselves. But I fully agree with what you've been saying now. And the absence of Poseidon at that one particular conference of the gods is very, very important at the end of Critias. And and how the Odyssey has a certain starting point as well, which again, I don't want to give away too much. I feel like I already have done so. But that being said, I like how we've just sort of like ended as we started full circle, beginning with the discovery of Troy by Schliemann and the subterfuge, the false hypotheses of the sophists that began to misdirect the minds of inquiring people back over a century ago. I mean, alluded to, you alluded to you know the theosophists with their Atlantean and Lemurian root races stuff has just contaminated so much of this thinking that's everywhere. It's so ubiquitous and very frustrating because the actual hard evidence and the data that is available for any Platonic thinker to discover is obscured so much by this fanciful like leaps into speculation unmoored by any actual rigor and self-honesty. And it's very frustrating, but I think that you've provided a very nice antidote for it. And again, the story of Troy that Homer is going through. If the city of Troy was discovered, where it was discovered, based upon Homer's writings, and if you take everything else, that's a lot of myth that Homer is introducing in Troy about the reasons why this war, this wasting war that annihilated a whole generation, maybe it wasn't fully just an entertaining story. Maybe this was something which deeply impacted the psyche of like the entire world, but especially the Athenians who emerged centuries later to recover a lot of the lost knowledge, lost wisdom that foolish people had wasted away by going into a war that could have been avoided based on maybe the manipulation of certain Olympian deities that saw human beings as just something to be moved around on a chessboard for their own
Well,
entertainment.
Well, try this one on for
Hmm.
size, Matt. I mean, the war, the Trojan War, which took place in the 12th century BC, immediately preceded a vast dark age. There's a great book about this that I haven't fully gotten into yet called 1177, the year civilization collapsed or something like that.
I saw the lecture by the author just like last week. That's an amazing point. Yeah.
So think about this. With the Greeks knew that happened. They knew that their society entered into a dark age, during which time what happened, Matt? They lost the use of writing. They became illiterate,
Yeah.
right? Linear B, they stopped using linear B and linear A or whatever. And later, only around the 8th century BC, was the modern Greek alphabet scooped up from the Phoenicians and modified so that they could have language again. So, literally, the thing that Solon is told by the Egyptian priest, you Greeks have lost your own history. You've lost writing, periodic disasters and things happen, and then you go back to dark ages. It actually happened. It's not a myth. It really happened right there, right? And so the allusion back to the Odyssey, which in turn speaks back, of course, to the Trojan War and the Iliad, is a clear callback to all that. So we just went another layer, right?
Yes.
So anyway, I know we have limited time, so I'm just hopeful
Yeah.
that these morsels will encourage anyone who loves the classical world, anyone who's interested in philosophy and history and ideas and how stories and myths can be structured to go back and read this for yourself. Of course, I would love it if you buy my book, The Atlantis Puzzle, out on Amazon worldwide. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And watch the movie too. I think there's a lot more to get out of it, and I certainly, Sarantatis did an amazing job. I like to think I did a decent job. There's still more to be found. So I wish everybody happy hunting and happy holidays.
Yeah, and all of, links to the movie and the book are going to be available in the description box under this video. So go do that now. Don't waste any more time. Christmas is coming. Get extra copies for your relatives. Jack, thank you so much, and I look forward to future chats.
Matt, thanks so much. This was really enjoyable.
Yeah.
Take care.